Welcome, everyone. I'm Monika Navarro, the Senior Director of Artist Programs at Firelight Media. Thank you for coming to the webinar about the PBS Firelight William Greaves Production Fund. Before I get started, I want to do a land acknowledgement, and I'll say that we do land acknowledgements because Firelight stands in solidarity with Indigenous communities and our Indigenous filmmakers in centering Indigenous stories. Their liberation is part of our liberation as we work to be interconnected in our work. I am in Brooklyn on the ancestral lands of the Munsee Lenape, and feel free to share a land acknowledgement where you are in the chat. I want to introduce our ASL interpreter, Nicole Pansino. Hopefully I said that correctly. Could be Pansino, but thank you for doing your important work today to help make this accessible. And behind the scenes, we have some other team members that are from Firelight to helping make the back end of this webinar run smoothly and help get your questions answered. So I want to give a shout out and a heartfelt thank you to Felicia, Scott, Patricia, and Nicole. Please type any questions you have that come up into the chat or the Q&A tool. We'll make sure those get answered. And I've got some info to share. I'll kind of do an overview of the William Greaves, the Firelight, excuse me, I'm sorry, I'm too caffeinated. The PBS Firelight William Greaves Production Fund, kind of just a general overview of this new fund that we launched and eligibility and the very common questions we've already been fielding from folks, and then leave plenty of time for a Q&A directly with you. And this will be on YouTube after the webinar ends, so you'll be able to access it or share it. So Felicia, go ahead and go to our first slide. Talk a little bit about the mission of Firelight. Hopefully you're, the next slide, please, familiar with Firelight Media, which was founded by Stanley Nelson and Marcia Smith. Two legends in their own right, and Firelight produces films and cultivates audiences and supports filmmakers of color as well as audiences of color, starting with our flagship program, the Doc Lab, and it's just grown exponentially since then, which this fund is part of that legacy of the programs that have expanded, but always, centered in who's centering our stories and stories that come from the community and caring as much about the audience that we engage that needs to see their stories and their histories reflected. Next slide, please. So in 2020, we launched the William Greaves Fund that started as a research and development fund. And this really came, I would say, I have to acknowledge Lloyda Limbaugh. This was really her vision, along with listening to our filmmakers who, coming out of the Doc Lab or other programs that, made a great first film or second film and had success, but how challenging it was to continue to sustain your work, or a film that you're very passionate about that wasn't easy to fundraise for. And so these funds are created to address that gap of sustainability, that need of sustainability for mid-career filmmakers. And this year, we launched in partnership with PBS. We expanded the William Greaves Fund not only for that research and development fund, but this PBS Greaves Production Fund, which would be a co-production fund for distribution on PBS. Obviously, Stanley has had many films that have aired on PBS, so there's been a long partnership there. PBS, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, has been a longtime supporter of the Doc Lab. So we're very excited to partner with PBS to keep supporting and finding a broadcast home for these films that need to be seen by the American audience. But I also want to acknowledge the work of Beyond Inclusion. That I think this fund wouldn't exist were it not for the advocacy of those filmmakers that really, asked public media to do better. And I think this fund is a beginning of that, of how we can, have more resources for our films and keep sustaining mid-career filmmakers. Next slide, please. So just to be clear, because we now have two funds, this webinar is going to be for the new co-production fund. If you are interested in the research and development fund, I think you need to keep advancing, Felicia, because it's got a couple bullet points. If you've got questions, please go to our website, read about the Art Research and Development Fund to see if that's maybe more appropriate for where you're at with the project you are seeking support from. Email our team. It's got the same deadline but we are going to focus on this new co-production fund, but they're doing office hours, the team that is overseeing the research and development fund. But next slide, please, because we are focusing on the production fund. So this co-production fund that we launched, similar to the R&D for mid-career filmmakers of color, it is for US based. The research and development is also has some international, that's open to filmmakers in Colombia, Brazil, and Mexico. This one is just for folks based in the US and its territories. And also it is not a grant, it is a co-production fund for distribution on public media. It is for directors, co-directors, and producers who have at least 2 hours of films, cumulative, any genre, that have had distribution, whether that's broadcast, streaming, or festival. And you'll see on our website in the application that we've got, you know, a list of festivals that would make it eligible. Because we really are wanting this to be completion funding, or at least significantly get you to closing that budget gap so that you can complete the film, you do have to have already secured a minimum of 20% of the total project budget. And then lastly, we do have some discretionary funds available for acquisitions, commissions, and pre-sales. Should note, Firelight doesn't have real estate on PBS, much like other entities that have production funding for public media like ITVS or the National Multicultural Alliance, which is Black Public Media, Center for Asian American Media, Vision Maker, Pacific Islanders in Communication, Latino Public Broadcasting. All of those folks have some sort of way to distribute their work, whether with the great educational distribution that CAM and Vision Maker does. PIC has Pacific Heartbeat, Black Public Media has Afropop, Latino Public Broadcasting has Voces, ITVS, of course, has Independent Lens. We don't have real estate. So if you do want discretionary funding, you do need to have a committed broadcast with a public media strand. And that would be, you know, a direct ask to us, but have had that letter of commitment from a broadcaster. But for this open call that we're going to talk about, you don't need to have secured a broadcast, but your intention is to distribute your film on public media. And if you've already got some development or production funds from any of those entities, great, because you've already assigned your US broadcast rights to the film, and we will happily work in partnership with all of those folks. So that's kind of the overview of what this fund is and who's it for, but we wanted to get into who is eligible, because I would say that is the most common question that we're getting is around eligibility. So it is for nonfiction producers, directors, and co-directors who self-identify as Black, Indigenous, or a person of color. Felicia, if you can advance, because I think the bullets will pop up as you. Okay, keep advance. Okay, I think I'm just talking here. Sorry. Whoop, go back one. Forgive us. This is a new platform for me. So who's eligible? As I said, producer, director, co-directors who are BIPOC. You must be a resident, just based. We don't mean legal resident. We do support undocumented filmmakers. So when I say resident, I just mean this is where you are based in the US or US territory. You must be mid-career. Mid-career is a bit hard to define. We had to put some parameters around it. So how we've defined it, to differentiate a little bit from the Doc Lab and other programs we have that are more for early career or emerging filmmakers, is a minimum of 7 years of filmmaking experience. That's intentionally expansive and not defined, so that you could be someone who's been working as a associate producer or assistant director or an editor for many years and recently started producing and directing, or a longtime producer director, but just, you know, that 7 years is your experience. You do need to have a credits, 2 hours of films, whether that's 2 features, 2 1-hour broadcasts, a feature and shorts, that would add up to 2 hours, any genre. So it can be nonfiction, it can be narrative, it can be experimental animation, but they must have had some sort of distribution, whether that's a national broadcast, streaming, or an Academy Award qualifying festival, which we have a link. Film Freeway has, and the Academy has really diversified which festivals are inclusive of that. But if for any reason that is a stopping point, please reach out to us, because this is the first year of this grant, not a grant. See, I caught myself. This is the first year of this co-production fund. So we are learning of what are the needs and what are the obstacles that our mid-career filmmakers are facing. You must own the copyright or minimum 50%. Sorry, we're not quite there yet, Felicia. 50% of the copyright of the film. That's important because public media wants you to own the copyright. You will have final say. We will certainly have notes, as will our partners, but ultimately you have editorial control, and that's a really important thing in public media, that you retain that right. And it's why you need to have the copyright, or at least have 50% of the copyright. As I said, you need to have 20% of your total production budget before applying. This is not for student filmmakers, or a project that's part of like a university program or a degree program. You cannot work for Firelight or PBS. Hopefully that's clear, or be on our board. And lastly, there's some folks that were recipients of the Spark Fund. You are as long as you meet the other eligibility requirements, we welcome our Spark Fund grantees to apply. Okay, our next common question is, what qualifies as a mid-career filmmaker? I think I answered this, that we were intentionally expansive with that. And I also answered about the credit, the 2 hours of credits. So hopefully that's clear, but we'll see in the questions. You can go to the third bullet point, Felicia, if you want to advance it. Another common, yes, is there a minimum or maximum length for my documentary? This is another common question we're getting. We are fine with you having versions of the film, but this is co-production funding for the broadcast version. So you may have a theatrical version or a festival version or an educational, but in terms of the broadcast, it's the standard PBS broadcast lengths. So for a feature, that would be 8640 or 15640. A broadcast hour would be 5640, or a short would be 2640. So as long as you intend to make a broadcast version and could edit it to one of those lengths. So, but again, you may have other versions that can be a director's cut that is longer, or an educational version that's shorter. Our budget would not be able to cover that, so you will need like an outside budget for that, because we are only supporting the production of the broadcast. The next common question we've gotten is, what is the maximum amount I can request for this fund? This is a new fund. We have a $1 million budget to distribute for films, and it's going to be project by project. We need to see what your budget gap is. You will need to have secured 20%, as I mentioned. It's just for the broadcast version, so the production budget, so obviously you may have a bigger budget that's with festival versions or marketing and impact, but we just need to see the production budget and what's that gap. It would be wonderful if our monies could close that gap, or at least get you really close and make a significant investment, so that the burden of fundraising is off of you somewhat alleviated, or leveraging these monies with other funders to close that gap. So the size of the financial commitment is to be determined, but we are hoping to make it pretty significant, especially because this is for production or post. So it's hard to say right now what the range is going to be when this is the first time we're funding projects. But I think what's most important, similar to when you apply to ITVS, is like, what is your gap to complete this film? And then we will, see what we can contribute to that. And the number of projects we will support really is going to vary on the award amounts, but we are, as I said, hoping to fund people significantly. So it may be funding lesser projects at a higher amount, so that these projects can actually get completed over the next year and get distributed. And I think the last common question we have, moving quickly through this, so we're going to have a lot of time for Q&A, is what stage should my project be in? Hopefully in the name, it's clear that this is a production fund. So if you are seeking development, you should be applying to the Greaves R&D fund. You can be in early production as long as you have a work sample that meets that requirement. We're asking to have the work sample be 10 to 20 minutes unless you have a rough cut. So if you're in early production and you have a 10-minute work sample, we welcome your application. And then that is, you need to have secured 20% of the budget. So generally, you could be mid-production or early production or late production as long as that budget is secured and you have a work sample. So you must be in either production or post. The film can be close to completion. That's fine because often a film may be needing those finishing funds to do the final edit and do all of the costs of onlining the film and getting it ready for distribution. So if the film is at a fine cut or at an advanced rough cut, as long as you know that we will have notes, so as long as it's not, locked, that you'd be willing to open the edit if that, there's some notes from us and PBS. Because we will be your co-production partners. So again, you always would have editorial control. The notes are not meant to be prescriptive, but they are, with our experience of producing films, with some, obviously, with, some folks for decades for public media. So kind of, knowing what's going to fit for a broadcast audience, but obviously still, how does it align with your vision for the film? So those were the common questions we've been getting. So I'm hoping there are questions from the audience. Nicole Docta is managing all that, and let me see what's come in. So I know there were one question had been submitted in advance about how much funding is available for individual projects through this fund. So I answered that in the common questions. And you'll see this slide up here is these important dates, that the deadline for both William Greaves funds is August 8th at 11:59 p.m. Eastern, and we will be notifying you by October of whether you are recommended for funding or if we have passed. So it looks like the first question we have, and please put your questions in the chat because we have lots of time, is are filmmakers allowed to apply for the production fund for one project and R&D for another project? Yes, that may change in the future, but right now, because this is the first time we've launched this co-production fund, and we hope our mid-career filmmakers are working on multiple projects at multiple stages of production. We don't want to impede your ability to be producing projects. So right now, we may determine, if who we fund. So it is not guaranteed that both projects will get funding, but you certainly can apply to both if you've got two projects in different stages. Hopefully that answered the question. If you need a clarifying or follow-up, please put it in the chat. The next question is, does the 20% secured must be from the budget of the entire film or only the production budget? Only the production budget. Again, and I know this from my own experience producing for public media, there's your budget that's for all the versions and everything you're going to do with the film. But if you're producing for public media, there's some constraints around what public media can fund, because these are public dollars. So it has to kind of adhere to those standards that are in the PBS Red Book. If you have questions around what can and can't be included, but it is just the production budget to develop for the broadcast version. I hope that's clear. I guess the follow-up to, are filmmakers allowed to apply for the production fund and another for the R&D? Does it have to be different filmmakers, team members, or the same director? It's not either or. It can be the same director who's, as I said, has a project in development and one in production or post, so they would apply to both funds. It could be a producer on the same project. I think determine who's going to be the best fit, who's going to be the signatory. So it really is open. I think that's for your team to decide whether the producer or director is the right person to apply. So we got another question that was submitted in advance, and I think this is a good question around kind of who's considered a mid-career director. So this question we got in advance is, I made documentaries 35 years ago, later became a PBS broadcaster, won an Emmy, and continued working as a producer-director for companies and an HBCU. I'm now producing and directing an independent project. Am I eligible for this fund? Maybe. I think so, but it depends on, certainly the 35 years checks the box of 7 uh, years of filmmaking experience, but did your do you have enough credits as producer, director, or co-director on films that had distribution through our other requirements that would make you eligible? So hopefully that's yes. But if not, I would say reach out to us because we are learning as we go. But uh, at first glance, I think so, but it's without seeing your CV, it's hard to determine. Okay, next question. Are filmmakers also allowed to submit 2 projects to the production fund? Um, that's a good question. Since I guess I will have to say yes because it's not explicit that you can't. Again, this is year 1. We may change. We may have to make a rule in for year 2. But since we right now do not explicitly say that you can only submit 1 project per applicant, you can submit 2. I would say make sure that you feel really confident about both. If one is more fully developed and kind of meets all the other requirements of having a secured budget and feeling really strong about the work sample and the proposal, maybe go with the stronger project. But if you feel like both are equally strong and worthy of our consideration, please send it forward. But I think you'll know best like what actually fits this fund. How would Firelight be a producing partner if we already have funding from a consortium? And I think by consortium, you mean the National Multicultural Alliance that used to be called, I can't even remember what the previous, I think it was Minority Consortia. And I think now it's National Multicultural Alliance. How would we be your producing partner? Well, they're your producing partner as well. So I guess I'm used to that language that, if you have a co-production agreement with ITVS, they're your producing partner. If you have a production agreement with, say, Center for Asian American Media, the film's going to be either a co-production of or produced in association with those entities. So we would be another partner. So we would be working collaboratively. So let's say you have either development or production funding with the Center for Asian American Media, then we would be working with you and with Cam to help this film, come to completion. So the deliverables will probably be pretty aligned. So, you would be sending both of us cuts and hopefully would be, receiving notes from both entities and we'd be working together to determine what's the best broadcast home if it hasn't already secured a commitment from a broadcaster. So I guess that's what I mean by producing partner in terms of, having deliverables, receiving notes, and collaborating and in our communications and in our strategies to help the film find a home. Again, if my answer didn't answer everything, please welcome follow-ups because we've got about a half hour more. Does the production budget include post-production? Yes, I think by production budget, my meaning by that is like the budget to produce the film and deliver the broadcast version. So it doesn't consider like the marketing costs or theatrical versions, festival versions. It's just everything needed to produce and deliver the film, the broadcast version of the film. So it absolutely should include post-production costs because we're actually hoping this covers most of your post-production costs or significantly. What other questions do folks have? Just give me a second as Nicole cuts and pastes questions from the chat. Oh, no other questions yet. Okay. Well, don't have. Please put any questions you have about this fund in the chat. I would say you can ask some project-specific questions. Feel free. We have the time. Here's one. Do we need to specify a set grant amount in our proposal? Funding amount, not a grant. Grants are unrestricted. This has restrictions because it will be a license fee for your film. But we want to know the gap. I think what we've asked is, what is the total budget? What are the secured monies that you've raised in the producer cash, so that we understand what's the gap, so that we can determine how much, if the project's selected and recommended for funding, how much. So for example, if you have a $500,000 budget and you've raised the 20%, so you've raised $100,000, I think we would see, okay, maybe you have some pending grants from folks you've applied to, and please don't take that this would be our average. I'm just using as an example that maybe we would then commit $250,000 so that it would close half of your budget gap, and want to ensure that you have a strong fundraising plan of how to close the rest of that gap, or know that our funding may help amplify the project, or help push other funders to attach, so we can close it and help you finish it. So it will be specified in that you need to say, what's the total budget, what have you raised and secured, and so we understand the gap. Okay, the next question is, I produced, directed for PBS for 25 years. I don't know, when you say for PBS, you mean as like an in-house producer or as an independent producer? As an independent producer who then, your films are distributed, so maybe you could clarify that in the chat. Because I know for many years, various PBS stations and strands did have in-house producers, and I'm now an independent filmmaker. May I use those PBS credits towards my mid-career filmmaking? Okay, I think you do mean you were like an in-house producer or worked directly with the strand. Yeah, I would say that should count. If you were producing for PBS, the films were distributed on PBS, and as long as that you met the 2-hour minimum, I would say you are eligible. What other questions, folks? One question I've gotten, because I've been doing some office hours with folks, was about the work sample. Whether there was different work sample lengths if you're in production or post. Because so many funds ask for different, so many funders have different requirements, and it is the same whether you are in production or post-production. We just ask that the work sample be between 10 and 20 minutes. If it's longer than 20 minutes, you will need to indicate which 20-minute section to watch. Please don't have it scattered where watch time code from here to here, and then watch this clip, and then watch this clip. That's a bit burdensome to ask of the readers. So it's really better either for you to just edit a string out of clips, or just specify one time code start and end of where we should watch. If you have a rough cut, I hope it is a true rough cut, not a 2 or 4 hour assembly. But if it's a 10 to 20 minute work sample or a rough cut, and we will be watching the whole rough cut. But that's why I really ask that you feel like it is a strong rough cut and not just a structure cut or assembly edit. Okay, cool. In-house producer director, they clarified. So yes, I think I answered that I would say if you were an in-house producer and the films were distributed on PBS and you meet that 2-hour cumulatively of the films you had those credits on, I think you're eligible. And I think that's great. You're producing independently after a long career in a station. You certainly know the audience. Okay, the next question is, Can I count a film series towards the broadcast requirement if I'm in the process of shopping for streaming outlets? 180-minute series. Okay, so if I understand you correctly, and please put a follow-up if I don't, um, I think you are saying that your series is complete, but has not been distributed or published yet. So it really needs to be like completed work that has distribution. Because unpublished work, we don't know if it will get published. So it really needs to have either been it either needs to have like played at a festival from that festival list, or a major streamer or VOD, or a major broadcaster. Um, so it can't be one that you're shopping, I think, that's not distributed yet, unless, if the series, or maybe like an episode of the series, has got a commitment from a festival or a commitment from a broadcaster. I think we can consider that, but you would need that letter of intent. So I hope that's clear. So the next question is, when you are talking about the broadcast version of the film, that's a separate budget and proposal for the theatrical version of the film. Yes and no. I would say it's the same budget without the costs of onlining the theatrical version. So, the edit weeks, you will probably be, editing the film, and the theatrical version or the festival version may be done first. And you need to ensure that there's like the edit, we'll have milestones with you of um, submitting a rough cut 1, submitting a rough cut 2, a fine cut, and then, the broadcast version. So sometimes folks, fine cut is actually their festival or theatrical version. Because if the final one is the broadcast, and usually that needs to be cut to time. So all to say is, I think the most efficient way to do it sometimes is that, if your fine cut is like your festival or theatrical version, knowing that you will need to cut down to fit that standard PBS length, that can be the most cost-effective way to maximize your budget. But the cost of onlining the festival or theatrical version, that can't be included in this budget. And you need to make sure you've saved funding for the budget week or weeks needed to do the broadcast version of the film, and that, we're paying for the online of the broadcast version. So, there's ways to kind of maximize that. I know that I'm producing a film that's ITS supported, and it was low budget, so was trying to, as much as we can, make those make those ITDS funds stretch for us for our festival version, but had an outside grant that allowed us a little bit more flexibility to cover the costs of the festival version. So hopefully that answers it. Okay, there was a clarifying question on the film series. The work sample is complete but not fully broadcast distributed yet. However, we've screened it. Well, you will need to have screened it at one of those qualifying festivals, not just had like it would need to have screened at one of those qualifying festivals. So if it's like, again, an episode or a film, let's say it's a 60-minute episode of this series or a 60-minute film, that screened at a qualifying festival, I would say that could count. Or since it's a 180-minute series, yeah. I'm not sure what's screened, but whatever has screened, and so long as it was one of those qualifying festivals, that should count towards your credits. What else, folks? What other questions do you have? I do encourage you, if we are seeing that, folks around the eligibility and this credits, like adding up your producer, director, co-director credits to the 2 hours, that does seem to consistently be what is a barrier for folks. So those are the parameters we set with PBS, but I would say send us a note if you feel like you're CV um, should should show that you are a mid-career filmmaker, because we know that um, certainly with producers, we we have an equity issue around producers of color. I don't know if folks are familiar with the Dear Producer survey, but when you see the race ethnicity stats on producers, it's appalling. There's a lot of work to do, and clearly we need more support to make this a more sustainable field for producers of color. So we appreciate that. So I would say, that's, if you feel like you can make a case, write us. But again, it was partly to differentiate that you're not someone that would be eligible for like the doc lab or some of our other programs, which, the doc lab is for first and second time feature directors. So we're trying to draw a line that if you're eligible for the doc lab, you wouldn't really be eligible for any of the William Greaves funds. So we have to kind of draw a line somewhere. But we understand there's some folks that are in a bit of a gray area because of the equity issues in our field. Okay, good. We've got a lot more questions. Um, on a creative level, are you looking for anything specifically? Should we look for a connection to the body of William Greaves' work? Oh, that's a really good question. This fund is named after Stanley Greaves, excuse me, William Greaves, because he was Stanley's mentor. And I think it's in the spirit of what a visionary filmmaker William Greaves was, and what an expansive body of work he had. And he actually did some really groundbreaking work with public media. So I would say that's the kind of genesis and inspiration of calling our mid-career funds the William Greaves Funds. It's an acknowledgement and an honor of William Greaves, who was Stanley's mentor. And we don't want to be prescriptive of, what we're looking for. I mean, I think really you should be telling us why this is a film that you believe should be on public media. I mean, if you look at the mission of PBS, it is meant to have a diversity of voices, and this is helping fulfill that mission. I think if you look at kind of the mission of Firelight to support filmmakers of color and cultivate audiences of color, and centering our stories, and when you look at the PBS mission and why it was founded, and I think that sometimes folks need to see a film that pushes boundaries creatively. And actually, public media has like a history of experimentation. There was like incredible video art that was showcased in public media in the 80s, and so many filmmakers that we respect that were visionaries, like Marlon Riggs, whose Tongues Untied was on public media. Hale County, This Morning, This Evening is often a film that's like inspired folks to see like, oh wow, that film was on public media. That means there's room for a film like mine. Or Who Streets, which was a Doc Lab film and was on POV. And so many examples actually of like projects that have gone through the Doc Lab, that themselves like push the boundaries. Or I also think that it can just be radical, that this is a genre that is colonial. And often people of color have been the subjects of documentaries. So for you to be the person behind the camera, for you to be centering the story, and from your lived experience or the lived experience of the community, you actually, I think, can use really traditional documentary vocabulary, but it's actually quite radical in who's telling the story. So all to say is, we're not looking for anything specific. We're looking for things that I would say, if it's a connection to the body of William Greaves' work, in that spirit of like artistic excellence and being really visionary with the work. But I think that's true to everything we support at Firelight. What do you look for in the prior work sample? That's a really good question. One, we want to ensure, it's partly to help us do our due diligence and ensure that you have completed and distributed work that kind of checks those boxes. But I would say in the prior work sample, I always like to know, how does this new project relate to your recent work or the work that you're most proud of? Is it a departure for you creatively or thematically? Or is it building on what you've done? Sometimes folks are almost building like a trilogy, or they're kind of going deeper into a theme. I think of someone like Rodrigo Reyes, who we've supported through William Greaves and through the Spark Fund, who's I would say does border cinema, but the border, it's so expansive. The experience of the border is a metaphor from his work that is across documentary and narrative. So it's really more about this film that you're seeking funding for. How does this film speak to how you are growing or how you are developing as a filmmaker, and how does that prior work relate to it? I would say that's we're looking to understand you as a filmmaker in the prior work. Does educational distribution count for credits? That's a really good question. We don't have educational distribution there, but I know Third World Newsreel is an excellent distributor. I would say send us a note. If the films, if none of the films played in any of those qualifying festivals, please send a note to us again with your CV and highlight the films that were distributed. Because I think I'd want to understand, did they just have educational distribution? What other distribution did they have, to try to understand a little bit more, how it might align with the requirements we've set. So I'll give a couple more minutes if there's any more questions. Otherwise, I'd say we could wrap early. Maybe we can go really quick to that last slide, Felicia, where folks can see how to contact us. If you do have questions as you're working on your application, hopefully you've all started a draft application. If you haven't, definitely start a draft application to see. We are using the new nonfiction core application. We've been working with Sundance and IDA and many other partners on what was the doc core application and updating it based on what lots of funders were hearing from applicants and questions that folks were asking. And so that's why you'll see some new questions you've maybe never seen before around like accountability, because we and IDA and Southern Doc Fund, I think, are some of the first organizations to use this new nonfiction core application. So please do start a draft if you haven't yet, so you see kind of everything that's expected to submit. If you have questions, especially if you feel like you are a mid-career filmmaker, but the requirements we have are not inclusive for inclusive for you and the work you've done, please email us, because as I said, we are learning a lot, and the goal is to address the sustainability issue in our field, but we'll continue to adapt, adopt, and improve this fund, but it's the first year of the fund. So it is about 4:45 on the East Coast. I don't think there's any new questions. This is the last call for questions. Otherwise, you know how to get in touch with us. Make sure you're also signed up for our newsletter. That's always the way to get the latest and greatest news from Firelight. Thank you all for being here today. Thank you for your really excellent questions. We are looking forward to receiving your applications. And thank you again to everyone behind the scenes that helped produce this webinar. Special thanks to you, Nicole Pansino, for interpreting, and thanks again to Felicia, Scott, Patricia, and Nicole, other Nicole, who are working behind the scenes. Okay, well, thank you, gracias, and good luck. Don't wait till 11:55 on August 8th to upload your project. Have a good day.